Good.
Let me ask this first question about a scenario of breakdown, because it's, from both of you, it's hard to pin down a specific scenario of a regime breakdown. But there is one that I think many people are wondering about. That is, it's conceivable that a gradual process of democratization can accelerate and then create a momentum that the regime cannot control. So the question for the two of you, for Andy, is that do you believe this Communist Party is resilient enough to manage a gradual process of democratic reform? And then on the other side, do you think it is so fragile that as soon as such a process gets kicked off, it will mushroom into a massive anti-regime movement?
I think Andy and I are going to agree again.
Okay.
First of all, I don't see the regime, I don't see anybody in the regime who's advocating any significant process of democratization. The village elections, which they've done, are to consolidate control, to get rid of unpopular village leaders by letting the peasants vote. If they move it up, as Wen Jiabao has said, but this has been a long time brewing, to the township level, that is only the lowest level of the entire regime. And I haven't heard any important, powerful person in the regime who wants you hear about it from time to time, but I don't believe it's a serious goal to bring competitive elections any farther up the system than the township. And if they do, they've got all the methodologies for controlling so-called competitive elections that they've worked out in the case of the village. Now, the Taiwan example is often mentioned in this connection. There you had another kind of Leninist-style party that did undertake democratization in the expectation that it would continue to win elections, and it won the first presidential election when Lee Teng-hui was reelected, but then it lost to the opposition. But mainland China, I think, is not Taiwan. It's not a client state of the United States. It's not threatened by any outside force. It doesn't have the long history of the opposition movement that Taiwan had, and the loss by the KMT was due to a split in the KMT rather than to the ability of the opposition party, the DPP, to actually win a majority. So my answer is
they're simply not going to do it.
They won't do it, but if that any democratization that they undertake will be under control, and the unexpected kind of things that got it out of control in Taiwan are not that likely. I mean, unexpected things can happen. I agree with Rod that they can happen, but
democratization is unlikely for a very simple reason. There's 70 million members of the Chinese Communist Party and counting. And they did not join the Communist Party to lose power, privilege, and the chance of corruption. So there would be an enormous weight in favor of any leader who opposed a leader who was offering the prospects of democratization. And it's absolutely true. Most middle-class Chinese, certainly the people I've spoken to, are not particularly looking forward to democracy. As one very senior academic put it, we were ruled for so many years, so many decades, by peasants. She meant the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. Why would we want democracy and be ruled by even more peasants? The intellectuals have recovered the position which they had in traditional times of being the governing elite, advising, indeed even governing on behalf of China, and they don't want to give that up. So I don't think it's likely either. The difference between Taiwan and the mainland is also that, in fact, in the Nationalist Party constitution, in their very weak ideology, they didn't have a Leninist ideology, they only had a Leninist party, and you can't have a Leninist party, real party, without ideology. But in their ideology, Sun Yat-senism, there was a commitment to democracy. and democracy as we understand it, not controlled village elections like the Chinese understand it. And you've got to let me just elaborate what Andy said about the village elections. What they're trying to do is very Confucian. What they try and make sure is that there are two candidates and both are okay. In other words, we know what democracy is about. Democracy is about being allowed to vote for any scoundrel you want to see in power.
We have two candidates and both are scoundrels.
I don't know what you're talking about. So I think that the idea that the Chinese will allow this very carefully controlled system of village elections to go up further is unlikely, because things can get more difficult as they go up the ladder. So I don't think that this is going to happen. If it does happen, if some leader thinks he or she, but more likely he, has got enough power to try and introduce some form of democratization, I think that the party would fall apart, because it has no commitment to democracy as we understand it in the way that the Nationalist Party really did.
Okay, here's one question from the audience. What would be the most important tangible indicators of regime failure that would portend a regime collapse? Rod? And then you.
Well, I think that in your book, Min-Shin, and in Andy's remarks and in my remarks too, all the signs are already there. The massive corruption, the pollution, and the Communist Party of China has not forgotten that corruption was a major factor in the demise of the Nationalist Party. It wasn't the only factor. Military defeat was a major factor. But it was an important reason why the middle classes lost faith in the Nationalist Party. There's corruption, a massive scale. There's widespread dissent because of all the corruption at the local level and what it leads to in terms of pollution and confiscation of land and so on. So I think that the factors are all there. The question is what will trigger them. All the elements for a really massive collapse are there. Andy described them. I've described them. They're there. But the question is, what will the trigger be?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I would say that if the system was going to collapse in years, not decades, as Rod predicted, there are things we should see now today. I think that's the thrust of the question. And I do see that the peasants and the laid-off workers and the people whose land has been seized are unhappy. I don't think those are indicators of impending regime collapse. What I would want to see today, if the regime is going to collapse within years, would be slowed economic growth, which I don't see, which could be most readily triggered by a slowdown in the U.S. economy, which I also don't see, although I'm not an economist for either of these two economies. But I mean, if we saw a tanking of the U.S. economy, I might begin to predict, trouble down the road for the Chinese regime. The second thing that I would want to see that I don't see is signs of a defection of the broad middle class. I'm thinking of about 300 million people. I'm not thinking of a tiny middle class. I'm thinking about the inclusive middle class. Rod mentions polling, and my colleague Tianjian Shi has done polling that shows that those people are pretty satisfied on balance. They have quite a lot of freedom in their personal lives. They think that the political system works pretty well. They themselves are doing rather well. Middle-class defection, which we could sense from polls or from conversations or from behavior of people not going back. My PhD students go back to China to teach. That was not the case with our students that we used to have from Taiwan years ago. Now it is. They also go back. The third indicator I'd want to see is signs of splits in the elite. Now, Rod is the Pekingologist par excellence. His book on the Cultural Revolution and his 3 preceding volumes on the origins of the Cultural Revolution satisfy me that you can see signs in advance of elite splits. You have to interpret this purge of Chen Liangyu in Shanghai. Is that a sign of a split or not? How you interpret it, to me it isn't, because I think that Joe Kahn's story was correct. It's a sign of the people in power consolidating power further.
Okay. Here's a question on inequality. The trend is rising in China, and the Communist Party's 11th five-year plan pledges to address this problem. What if after another 5 years and the problem is unmitigated? What will that do to China's stability?
Well, of course, having an unequal society is something which is potentially a source of instability. That unequal society has been growing, and this present administration in Beijing is pledged to try to do something about that. What some of you will know is that this is very unusual in East Asian development, that on the whole, East Asian countries have developed but kept equality pretty close between different groups in the society, and that's been totally abandoned by China, partly because of Deng Xiaoping's famous saying, some will get rich before others. Well, the question is, the others. At what time will they say, well, I'm still not rich, and you're not giving me hope? So I don't think that people who are poor, because they're poor, naturally revolt. That's not what history tells us. It's when they see themselves possibly getting a little better, and have some time to think about their position, that's when things happen. When they're poor, as many parts of China still are, they're too busy trying to scratch a living to think about revolting.
The fact that the party is aware of it and has pledged to address it is an example of what I meant by adaptive policy change. As long as inequality coexists with a rising median income, I don't think it's going to become a crucial social issue, and that has been the case. Even if that were not the case, in China, more so than elsewhere, the people who suffer the short end of the stick have less access to power. You don't have a universal vote. They can't get together and vote the what is the word we use here, the polite word, voting people out? Bums. You can't, in China, you can't vote them out. Really, the poor in China, who are on the low end of the Gini coefficient, are isolated in these rural villages. They are isolated in sweatshop jobs where they're locked up 6 days a week for 10 hours a day or much more than that. They don't have a good way to make their dissatisfaction known. Nonetheless, the regime is out there trying to fix the situation.
Okay. There's a question about the evolution of the leadership. Who do you expect to be Hu Jintao's successor? And what can we expect from the fifth generation leadership?
Well, Andy's last two books that I know of, there's a third one which he mentions in a footnote, which hasn't out yet, are all about how the leadership has been changing over the last 10 years or more. And so he really should be the answer of this. I've not the slightest idea who's going to be Hu Jintao's successor, assuming that Hu Jintao lasts till 2012. I don't think Hu Jintao knows who's going to be his successor, is more to the point, because he is not in a position to go around the country like Mao did and pick people out, and suddenly they are helicoptered into positions. Deng Xiaoping also did the same, to a lesser extent, but he did it. Hu Jintao can't really do that. I think that it is true that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to get back to some kind of a meritocratic Confucian system of recruiting its leaders. But I just don't think Hu Jintao knows. What any leader wants, anywhere, is that his or her legacy is respected. Mao wanted someone who would carry on the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping wanted someone who would carry on the reform. That's why he nearly, as Andy rightly says in this paper, why he nearly to try to sack Jiang Zemin when he thought he wasn't going fast enough on reform. So Hu Jintao will want to have as his successor someone who's going to carry on whatever he thinks of as his legacy. At this moment, what his legacy will be is not clear.
The system that they've worked out, I was referring before to this institutionalization or regularization of the succession system. They have these meetings of the party Congress every 5 years. So Hu Jintao came in 2002. He and his people, the current Politburo Standing Committee, came in the 16th Party Congress in 2002. So 5 years after 2002 is 2007, the 17th Party Congress. We're going to see the retirement of people who've hit the age ceiling, that is 70. Let's see, how does that rule go? That they're going to become 70 within the next I think it is. I forget. The rule is not that it doesn't. Well, but it worked the last time. The last time that it didn't work was with Jiang Zemin. But I expect to see a bunch of the current standing committee members step out. Right now, I can't remember exactly who they are. Huang Zhu, Jia Qinglin, and others whose age is above the ceiling, which is something to do with the age of 70. And we'll see a couple, 1 or 2 or 3 people from this younger age window, which is the people who are now in their 50s, I think it would be, coming in. Now, in China's New Rulers, which I co-authored with Bruce Gilley, we do name some names: Li Keqiang, Xi Jinping, and Bo Xilai. And so we'll see. I certainly agree with Rod that I don't know, and Hu Jintao doesn't necessarily know for absolutely certain who it's going to be, but I think those are the leading candidates. And people stay in a leading candidate position in China for years and years and years and years. You don't get somebody coming up from left field, as we do in our own political system, whom nobody has ever really heard of. You get leaders who've been under the scrutiny of the party's organization department and the top leaders already for many, many years. So these are the guys that I think will be likely to come in at that time. They will then have another 5 years to be looked over and see how they perform and whether they get caught in corruption scandals or their followers do and so forth before 2012, when some of those generation will succeed. Just the predictability that somebody from a particular age group is going to succeed to the roles of party secretary and head of state and head of the military commission and premier is quite a high level of predictability for any political system.
Okay, now, leadership split. Is the leadership more likely to split in face of a foreign policy crisis or a domestic crisis? And more specifically, what will a scenario of war on the Korean Peninsula do to China's leadership cohesion?
Right, you don't always have to go.
No, okay. Yes.
It seems a little unfair that you should have to.
Okay.
And I don't have a conviction about whether it would be domestic or foreign that would be most likely to cause a leadership split, although I think the two kinds of crises are very easily linked together. Say, for example, around Japan, when people demonstrate against Japan, they are also reflecting various dissatisfactions against the leadership, and it becomes a domestic crisis. I mean, a foreign policy crisis would itself cause some kind of domestic dissatisfaction. So I don't have an answer to that. I already gave my idea of the most likely scenarios: Taiwan, North Korea, economic downturn, or a public health crisis. In the case of a North Korean situation, obviously how that would go is very unpredictable, but probably a chief concern of the Chinese leaders themselves is a flow of refugees into northeast China that could be quite massive and could cause a big setback to the economy there. They wouldn't like to see a Korean situation that ended up with a Korea unified under a government allied with the United States. That is to say, if a Korean scenario unfolded in such a way that the South won and took over and maintained its alliance with the U.S., all big ifs, especially the last one, I think that wouldn't be too much in China's interest. I don't think it would necessarily lead to a split in the leadership either, though. If there were actually the use of nuclear weapons on the peninsula, then God knows which way the fallout would blow and how that would affect the situation in China. So that's some pretty mealy-mouthed responses to that question.
I think that we have seen one example of leadership disagreement in terms of foreign policy, and that was over the bombardment, the missiles that were used as a demonstration in the Taiwan Strait in the mid-90s. I think there are people in this room who know a great deal more about that particular episode than I do. But I think that the indications are that Jiang Zemin was not keen on that he had his doubts about it, but that people who shouldn't have been in favor of it, who wanted to embarrass him as being insufficiently nationalistic, managed to form enough of a coalition to force him to agree to it. So I think on these very, very tricky matters, the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, that is a real possibility of disagreement. We have to look back to the Korean War in 1950. And as the armies of the United Nations, led by the United States, were marching up the peninsula after the Incheon landing by MacArthur, there was a debate, a discussion within the Chinese Politburo about what to do. And everyone was against intervening for obvious reasons, because China had just, the communists had just captured power. The economy was in terrible condition. They just fought a civil war and an anti-Japanese war for years. They didn't want to do it. And Mao carried the day. In those days, someone like Mao could carry the day. Whether his arguments were right or wrong really was beside the point. I don't think that's the case now. So I think that it's more likely that a foreign policy disagreement could lead to a split within the leadership, because it's so dangerous, Taiwan Strait or the Korean Peninsula, that people could quite easily, for very good reasons on both sides, disagree sharply.
This concerns the nature of the Chinese Communist Party today. How far is the CCP still a communist party in the ideological sense? And would it be possible, more accurate, to call it a corporate state or an oligarchy?
Well, I don't think it's really a doctrinaire communist party in the sense of Marxism, Leninism, but it was interesting that Joe Kahn said in his article, and this also is something that we forecasted in our book, China's New Rulers, that what who and one want to do is to build up the social welfare system, address, I forget exactly how Joe Kahn put it, but in our book, address inequality in the economy. There are some left-leaning ideals that are animating at least that part of the leadership. Of course, those are prudent things to do. They may be for stability as well. Also interesting to me is that among the semi-free intellectuals in China, intellectuals who conduct debates in China, who are not in exile, who are in China, but who nonetheless have quite a bit of elbow room to conduct various debates. The pro-liberal democracy ideas that were prevalent before 1989 are really in recession, and Chinese intellectuals have a lot of ideas that are neo-authoritarian, neo-conservative, neo-leftist, as they call it themselves. They're not really Marxist. There's post-colonial thinking, there's post-structuralism, there are all these trends which tend, all of them, to be critical of liberal democracy as an ideal. The intelligentsia is not really in favor of democratization either right now. They give different reasons. Some of them are that it's too early, that our country is too chaotic. Some of them are that liberal democracy is, then this comes to the question of communism. Some of the criticisms of liberal democracy by Chinese intellectuals are the classic criticism that liberal democracy is just a device to fool the populace into letting itself be exploited by capitalists.
What's the nature of the Communist Party? Well, it's a Leninist party without Leninism. At least it's got Leninism but no Marxism. It's a party which is there and it wishes to continue to control because it believes in control, because that's what it's always done. And it's not going to give up control. What's the nature of the party? It's a sort of Rotary Club of 70 million people who joined it because it's good for careers. So it is determined to stay in power. Absolutely determined to stay in power. I think that the what was the second half of the question?
Is it a corporate state or an oligarchy?
Well, you know, all these words can be applied to it. It's an autocratic state. It's repressive, and those people joined the party don't want it to be democratized because that'll be the end of their privileges. So I would agree with Andy. I think we're both absolutely on the same wavelength in thinking that democratization is not what the people who we think would want democratization are actually going to advocate, and that's very good for the party. So you can call it what you like, corporatist maybe. I think Rotary Club's not bad.
Okay, so this question naturally follows the answers you have just given. If the CCP does continue to rule for another 15 to 20 years, is this an obstacle to China's high-speed growth?
Who asked that question, and why would it be an obstacle? I don't even know where to begin. I don't know what you're implying by that question, but I don't see...
One-party rule, lack of rule of law, inequality, and so forth.
All right, well, good. All right, thanks. And the continuation of the state sector. I mean, they've... like the Internet and a lot of the other things I talked about, this is one of those things where they said it couldn't be done. Even Pei Min-shin says it can't be done. You got to marketize. Can't be half marketized. That seems to be an implication of Pei's argument. I'm not an economist, as I said before, but this party has so far managed to sustain a high rate of economic growth while keeping a quasi-marketized economy. In fact, by controlling the rate of conversion of the currency, by controlling the banking system, by controlling transport, by controlling what they call pillar industries, they've insulated their economy from a lot of shocks that they would otherwise not be able to control, and they seem to have turned that into assets for economic, those are beneficial to their strategy of economic growth. Their strategy of economic growth does depend very importantly on the Western markets, the U.S. and European markets. That's probably the chief vulnerability that I see, not Communist Party rule.
I think I'd agree with that. I think that the real problem for the Chinese Communist Party is that a competence mandate, as governments discover throughout the world, is a very insecure basis for hoping that your future will be as good as your past. Governments cannot be competent forever. And I think it's partly regimes get tired, even if they turn over. They get tired quite quickly in the West, and they will get tired in China. I don't think the Communist Party rule by itself, by definition, is inimical to economic development, but I do think that all the factors that Andy mentioned, namely particularly the dependence of the Chinese economy upon Western markets, absolutely crucial. And a downturn, as he said earlier, could be catastrophic. But I don't think that 10, 20, whatever years it is that they may continue to rule, by itself is going to harm the economy, simply because of what I said earlier. This is a Communist Party which decided that when Deng Xiaoping came back to power in 1978 that it had to promote economic growth for the prosperity of the country and the people, otherwise they'd be out. That is what they are strong about. There are neo-Maoists in China today who are arguing, because of the inequality, that the Maoist system was much more equal and we should go back to that. And the regime has already issued an indication that it is not going to put its turn its back on reform. It's got to go on this path because it believes that that's the only way it will survive. So I don't think by itself communist rule is going to undermine the economy. There are all sorts of other things which happen in long-lived regimes. Regime tiredness.
I have two last questions on foreign policy implications. How will a resilient Communist Party maintain a stable, cooperative, peaceful foreign policy with its neighbors and with the rest of the world? And to you, how will the fragility of the Chinese Communist Party affect its foreign policy?
The grammar of that question seems to imply that the resilience of the party would be inimical to a cooperative. Yeah. But so maybe again I'm not understanding the question. But I think that one of the points that we've both developed is that the resilience of the regime actually depends upon its what they themselves say peaceful international environment and on its access to the Western markets, not only the export markets, but there's also the FDI and the technology and things like that. So I don't think that the search to stay in power constitutes an incentive for the regime to conduct an adventuristic foreign policy, if I'm making myself clear. It's just the opposite. To stay in power, one wants to keep a predictable international environment, to seek cooperation, to try to ensure energy supplies and so forth. Where's Michael Swain? He's the great expert on all this, but Michael and I don't see, right, Michael? Where is he? Signs of Chinese preparation to build a blue water navy to secure its sea lanes of communication, to stabilize its oil resources and challenge American primacy in the naval environment. We just don't see those signs. We don't see signs of China preparing the physical capability to invade the Middle East or Latin America to secure those energy resources, or signs of China, getting ready to invade countries in Southeast Asia. The military preparations are for Taiwan. The DOD then says, what will those military assets be used for after Taiwan? And we don't know when the magic moment of after Taiwan will come. But we cannot see an intent by the Chinese leadership or a capability being created to disturb the cooperative relations or status quo situation, or to challenge the American role in maintaining stability in the Asian region, things like that. I mean, one could go into much more detail. Maybe Jim Lilly sees different things. You guys have a debate.
How will fragility affect foreign policy? Well, it affected exactly the same way as not being fragile. The more fragile the regime, the less likely it wants to have foreign adventures, the less likely it wants to have an unpeaceful environment around it, of course. So that I think that the Chinese have decided that they need a long time, this Communist Party needs a long time to make sure that they re-legitimize with a competence mandate by making the country rich and powerful. And so, insofar as they feel fragile, they will want that peace to continue. The one area of exception, of course, would be the Taiwan Strait. What is very interesting about the concept of fragility is that the Chinese are more conscious of this than Americans. No one here, perhaps except a few specialists, will remember that it was John Foster Dulles who in 1957 said that he hoped that there would be a peaceful evolution of the Chinese communist regime into a democratic system. We've all forgotten that. The Chinese have not forgotten it. They still worry about peaceful evolution. They worry about peaceful evolution because of what happened, for instance, in '89, that ideas are coming in, they've got to come in. And the more that society is less under their control, the less they know about what people are actually thinking. Doubtless they may carry out their own opinion polls, but I think those are even less likely to result in honest answers. But I think because they feel fragile, because peaceful evolution is something they do worry about, because there are all these many things in the society, starting with corruption but not finishing there, which Andy and I have both emphasized, they feel fragile. They know that they are doing a race against time with the economy. They realize that the whole of the communist world has collapsed except for themselves, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, and Laos. And that they are the bulwark. They're the last bulwark. They've got to, albeit with a different banner, do what Mao was trying to do in the Cultural Revolution, keep the revolutionary flag going, because if they go down, then that's the end of it everywhere. So I think they do feel fragile. I think they've got reason to feel fragile. They don't know what the future will bring, and for that reason they are even more careful. And the last thing they want is adventurism in foreign policy.
The last question. What recent U.S. policy moves toward China do either of you think have been particularly counterproductive for a long-term, sustainable U.S.-China relationship?
Okay. I can't think what recent American policy moves towards China have been. The Secretary of the Treasury has just been there, and based on his previous acquaintance with them and his many, many trips to China, and doubtless the good relationships and the financial arrangements that he conducted while he was doing that, it was a good trip. And I think that if he suggested to them, look, we have a real problem in America. There's Senator Schumer and his colleagues who are going to put down all sorts of bans on you if you don't do something about your exchange rate. Well, if the Secretary of the Treasury, this Secretary of the Treasury says that, I think they'll listen. I think, they won't do much, but they'll do enough. Already the Schumer, I can't remember the other sponsor of the legislation, they've already said they're not going to push it now because they've been reassured. And that's what's going to happen. Americans, they know about Congress now. In the old days, they thought it was just Nixon and Kissinger who ran the place. They know about the Congress now. They're much more sophisticated now. And so their ears are attuned to any little change in congressional sentiment if it seems to be getting going. But I think that the United States has other problems at the moment, and I don't recall that there have been any major China initiatives recently.
Yeah, this is a tough question because of the particular way that this question is asked. Now, if I would like to answer a different question, therefore, which is that I believe that Chinese leaders think that many American foreign policies and domestic policies are unwise and counterproductive. I think they think that the U.S. has messed up the North Korea negotiations by threatening the North Koreans, and it's not that the Chinese are, not willing to use leverage to bring North Korea to the bargaining table, but the Chinese sincerely believe that the U.S. position is not one that in good faith they can advise the North Koreans to accept. I think they think our Iraq invasion was unwise and mishandled. I think they think that our policy with Iran is not going to get us any place. We say we won't accept Iran's actions, but we have no, in fact, option, diplomatic, economic, or military to prevent it. I think they think that our twin deficits are unwise, and that jawboning them about the twin deficits is kind of irrelevant. And I can't read my own handwriting. I think they, think a lot of our policies are unwise. But will that disrupt a long-term sustainable U.S.-China relationship? That's why this question is so hard to answer. it's hard to think of almost anything that would disrupt that relationship, because as we've both developed in our answers to previous questions, the Chinese need that long-term sustainable U.S.-China relationship, and they know it. And so they're intent upon preserving it while riding the sort of unpredictable waves of, U.S. domestic and foreign policy. If there were, if the two sides were to actually come to a war in Taiwan or in North Korea, that would disrupt the relationship. It's hard, but the policy of the U.S. government is not to have a war in Taiwan, and I believe in the end of the day, I hope, will turn out to be not to have a war in North Korea. And so then I kind of agree with Rod that even though they think many of our most important policies are bad ones, that's not going to disrupt the long-term sustainable relationship.
Good. Now we have time for closing remarks, and Rod will start with 5 minutes, and Andy, you will conclude this debate with 5 minutes of your own remarks.
Goodness, what else is there to say? I was once asked by Michael Swain, so you then believe in the Big Bang Theory, do you? And what he meant by that, and I said yes, what he meant by that was that my belief is that and here I think Andy and I agree, my belief is that you're unlikely to see a gradual change in the system as a result of the leadership deciding that it ought to change. I'm going to qualify that in a minute, but I think that is the main thing. And if we look back over the last 150 or so years that the Chinese have tried to come to terms with the outside world, as they gradually realized that they had to come to terms, the big changes were caused by really big bangs. The first big bang was defeat by the Japanese, whom they'd always considered to be sort of students, pirates, dwarfs, in the War of 1894-95. That was what impelled the reconsideration as to whether or not the Confucian system really was going to work. And once they abandoned the Confucian system for the government in 1905, the writing was on the wall, and by 1911-12, the Confucian system after 2,000 years was out. That was a very big bang. The second big bang, as I've already suggested, was the Cultural Revolution. Up till the Cultural Revolution, and including the Cultural Revolution, China was obsessed, China's leaders were obsessed with exceptionalism. We're China. We've been ourselves, we've been the teachers of our known world for 5,000 years. We're going to stay exceptional. We're going to stay being China. And so the attempt was, how do we be modern and Chinese? Or to use the phrase of the 19th century, how can we use the Chinese essence and the Western knowledge for practical use? How do we preserve the Chinese essence? And Mao's Cultural Revolution was the last gasp at that. And what I think happened at the end of the Cultural Revolution was a decision by Deng Xiaoping, look, that way has failed, we've got to jump on the East Asian type capitalist model. And so Chinese exceptionalism, I think, Andy hints otherwise in his paper, but I'm not sure what he meant. I think the idea of Chinese exceptionalism has to some extent disappeared. Not the enormous pride in being Chinese and what China has done through the century, but that idea that China can somehow chart a different road towards prosperity. I'm going to modify my my suggestion that the present system will only go with a big bang, whether it's a Tiananmen type sort of events or the Falun Gong type events writ large, whatever. Because I think that one thing that the Chinese have learnt in their interaction with the outside world over the last 150 years or more has been what it takes to get what they want most. They want prosperity, they want power, but above all they want respect. They want the respect of the outside world. They want particularly the respect of the United States for obvious reasons. And I think that as a result of reform and opening up, a lot of people in China have interacted with the West, and they know ultimately what will be the marker that gets them final respect. It won't be the extraordinary growth rate, though that's impressive. It won't be if they build very strong nuclear weaponry, though that will be something that the Pentagon will worry about. It will be if they develop a democratic system that gives human rights to Chinese, that gives the right for Chinese finally to be able to choose their own rulers. A system, incidentally, which would make for far greater stability in China than the present system. So I have just a small ray of optimism in my belief that a Big Bang is the way, unfortunately, that China tends to move in radically new directions, and that is that there is this core of people growing in number who know how to lead China to a more respectable, in the sense of getting respect from the outside world. The question is whether they will ever have the power, the courage, and the prestige to be able to bring it about. Thank you.
Rod accused me at the beginning of predicting the present to continue. He said that's much easier to do. But I would accuse him of predicting the past to continue, in the sense that what he's predicting is 89, Tiananmen, 99, Falun Gong. He says, those things happened before and they can happen again.
Even 1911, that's really bad.
And that really goes back, right, 1911. So I think from a sort of methodological point of view, neither one of us has an upper hand, except that those things did happen in 89 and 99, but what happened then? The Communist Party survived, in fact. So if one wants to predict events like that, one should predict the Communist Party surviving. But this is not 1989 anymore. A lot of things have changed. After 1989, inflation was conquered, maybe not for all time, but that was one of the sparks of 89, and it's no longer bothering the Chinese economy. Corruption was one of the sparks, and that problem is certainly still there. People's incomes have increased tremendously since 1989. China's foreign policy has enjoyed successes since 1989. As I've argued in my earlier remarks, the party has reformed itself since 1989 in terms of its succession mechanisms. It has created the People's Armed Police. It has created the Internet Police. So this is not 89 and it's not 99 anymore. A lot of things have changed. Second thing I'd like to address is the last gasp of Chinese exceptionalism. Rod said he picked up some hints in my paper that I don't hold that view, and that's right. I don't hold that view. I think that view is going to prove very misleading. In my view, the Chinese leaders and the intelligentsia in China and the broad society there still thinks the things that he mentioned, that we are China. We're going to do things our way. We're not going to do them in the Western way. And I think the search for a sort of alternative way to run a modern economy, an alternative way to run a modern political system, an alternative way to have they want to be modern, as Rod said very eloquently, but they don't want to be like us, and they don't want to be like Taiwan. I think they honestly see little that's attractive in our society or in Taiwan's society or political system, and they believe that their own, whatever it is, has the answer to the alternative modernity. And I can cite, lots and lots and lots of what I was alluding to before, neoconservative and neo-left Chinese thinkers who are not writing on the payroll of the party propaganda department who write about that. The American model or Western model has very low appeal in China, I'm sorry to say. And not only in China, but in a lot of places around the world, and not only because of Bush's policies, but because it simply doesn't have that much appeal in Iran and in many other countries around the world. So I think the notion that the Francis Fukuyama notion of the end of history, or Min Shin Pei's notion that China's transition is incomplete until it has complete market and complete democracy. As I said in my review of Min-Shin's book, I think that's not correct. Well, that opens the way to a huge, really academic argument about the and I'll give you some footnotes if you want. The final point that I want to address is the human rights part that I alluded to briefly. I think that given the fact that China is seeking and is very self-confidently seeking a whole alternative model for the economy, society, culture, and politics, its human rights violations are really very important to the fate, of the globe, not to make it any more ambitious than that. First of all, China's a place where it's hard to go and do business, or for foreigners to go and to feel secure. So that's bad on just a level of working there. And secondly, the Chinese system as it's now constructed makes it hard for all of us to solve the global public health and global environment issues. And these are all intimately connected to human rights, because the human rights victims in China are the ones that are advocating for the rule of law, for environmental issues, for public health victims and so forth. They become human rights cases after advocating for something else and running up against officials who don't want them to. And to build a just and equitable and sustainable globalization for the future, which is something that the U.S. itself has not done, its share of, but in addition to that, it's important for us that China do so. How to do human rights work in China under the circumstances of China's rise, China's self-confidence, it's much more difficult than it used to be in the past. And I don't have time to give my ideas about how to do it, but there are things that can be done.
Before I ask you to join me in thanking the two speakers, I have three announcements to make. First of all, the papers the two speakers have written will be posted on our website, as will be the transcripts and the video and audio for this debate. And in a month or so, we will have a second debate on the Chinese economy. And then throughout the year and next year, we will hold another 10 to 12 debates on various issues related to China. So keep tuned. And finally, please, the following people, please stay for lunch. Matthew Szymanski, Peter Van Huvelen, Greg Gross, Bernie Toon, John Ford, Tim Bergreen, John Stivers. Now let us thank the two debaters for this wonderful presentation. Thank you for coming.